Happy Sabbath, everyone, both here and on the webcast. Hope everyone had a good week. Hope everyone's enjoying the weather they have as best they can, depending on if they like the snow or not. Now, quoting to a website titled quoteinvestigator.com, a Mr. John Godfrey Sachs once made the following statement: "Laws, like sausages, cease to inspire respect in proportion as we know how they are made." Now, apparently this quote is often misattributed to Otto von Bismarck, but quoteinvestigator.com, as its namesake is, does work in trying to figure out who actually said certain things. And apparently, Mr. John Godfrey Sachs, who was a lawyer and poet in early America, was actually the first to make this statement. Well, as I'm sure you've heard variations of this quote before, but generally, the meaning behind this statement is that sausages are often made in a little bit of an undesirable way. Maybe it uses pieces of meat that you wouldn't normally eat outside of the form we all know and love. And so if you actually look behind the scenes and see how the sausage is made, it may be a little unappealing at first glance. And so likewise, Mr. Sachs was familiar with the legal system, being a lawyer, and was implying that many citizens might find the process of creating laws and of litigation somewhat unappealing as well. And so the reference to these sausages being made, quote unquote, refers to the unpleasant way in which a process or activity is carried out behind the scenes. Now, I'm sure that we can all think of examples of the, quote, sausages being made in your profession or your experiences. For me, I think about the university system. So it's about application time now. There's a lot of major deadlines, both for undergraduates and graduates applying for grad school. Often around December 15th is a big day, and often sometimes January 15th can be a big day for applying to schools. And being at the university, I've been speaking to a number of different folks about how the admissions process is really conducted. And of course, since my wife works in the administration over at the university, I really have gotten to know some unfortunate and unpleasant facts about how admission decisions are really made. For example, some students may wonder why their application to their dream school was rejected. Was it my resume wasn't quite as sharp as it needed to be, or maybe my GPA wasn't as high? But then there's the apocryphal tale of the professor who is reading at application number 65 and then gets called out to go to lunch and then returns to reviewing applications at number 68 and just skips a few applications, and turns out there's no real tracking of which applications actually got read, or maybe applications are intentionally unread just because the quotas were full, or people didn't have time, or the recommendation letter came from somebody whose name you didn't recognize, and so you didn't bother reading it. And so one of the reasons that seeing how these things happen behind the scenes, or, quote, how the sausages are made, is upsetting is because it often seems unfair or unjust. To reference back to Mr. Sachs's example, why are certain laws in place? Was it really in the best interest of the citizens, or was it to serve some other agenda, maybe the agenda of whoever donated the largest amount to the campaign? Or why wasn't I accepted into this program or this job opportunity? Was it because there were more qualified applicants, or is my application misplaced or just ignored? It seems like if you inspect any man-made process for a long enough period of time, you will uncover some dark secrets, the reminders that we in fact do not live in a perfect world. We may find that there are some things that may not be as fair, equitable, or just as they should be. And so this brings me to a question that has been asked in many different ways over the entire history of mankind. My guess is that probably the vast majority of people have asked this question in some form during their life, And it's a question asked potentially even many times throughout their life, and is often motivated by some deep personal hurt or despair in their current circumstances. Why is life so unfair? Other ways of phrasing this could include, why do bad things happen? Or perhaps more specifically, why are bad things happening to me? All kinds of people have asked this question, even including those who've had deep faith in God. Now, of course, we can see that some bad things happen due to time and chance. As it says in Ecclesiastes 9 and verse 11, time and chance happen to all of us. But this is distinct from the consequences of poor decisions and sin, which is what what was on the prophet Jeremiah's mind as he looked at the state of Judah. And so this is where I'd like to turn over to at first this afternoon. I'd like to turn over to the book of Jeremiah, and starting in chapter 12 and verse 1. Now Jeremiah was a prophet during a period of Judah's history right before Judah was taken captive by Babylon. And he had been called during his youth and was definitely devoted to doing God's work. Yet here was the question that he had for God. And he asked this question in Jeremiah chapter 12, and starting in verse 1. Jeremiah 12, verse 1. Righteous are you, O Lord, when I plead with you. Yet let me talk with you about your judgments. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why are those happy who deal so treacherously? You have planted them. Yes, they have taken root. They grow, yes, they bear fruit. You are near in their mouth, but far from their mind. But you, O Lord, know me. You have seen me, and you have tested my heart toward you. Pull them out like sheep for the slaughter, and prepare them for the day of slaughter. How long will the land mourn, and the herbs of every field wither? The beasts and birds are consumed for the wickedness of those who dwell there, because they say, he will not see our final end. Ending in verse 4 there. Jeremiah looked around in his time and saw all the evil and deplorable things happening in the age that he was called in. Why was this allowed for as long as it was allowed? There's evidence elsewhere in Jeremiah that not everyone in Judah had departed from following God, and yet they too were being dragged into the consequences of the ways of the wicked. We know that God only tolerates a rebellious nation for so long before he removes his hand and allows them to face the consequences of their own actions. And this is why Judah was eventually punished by being taken into captivity, just like Israel had been about 100 years prior. But during this period of time before their captivity, the way this nation was operating, with the wicked flourishing, that didn't seem right and just to Jeremiah. And Jeremiah's question is certainly one we might find ourselves asking in the world we live in today. So why does life seem so unfair? Well, let's see what Christ has to say about how the world functions. And we can find a very concise statement about this in John in the 8th chapter, starting in verse 44, or reading just verse 44 here, where Christ is addressing a group of Jews who sought to kill him. And John 8:44 simply states, "You are of your father, the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it." This is an unfair and an unjust world in many ways, because of who is in charge of it currently: Satan. Satan's desire is for our destruction, both physically and spiritually. And what better way to cause hurt than to do all that he can to remove truth and justice from this world? Because of man's choice to reject God's guidance and make their own way, mankind has really just accepted Satan's way, which leads to the state of the world that we see today, one that is evil and treacherous, where deeply unfair and unjust things can become the normal state of affairs. Now, if this were the conclusion of the matter, things would feel very hopeless indeed. But God has given us great hope in the future, which is why we're all here in this room today. Fortunately, brethren, we know God's plan, and so we know that God will return to this earth and put away Satan. God wants to redeem his sons and daughters, everyone in this room and everyone on this earth, from Satan and from this way, and bring us all back to living the way he intended for us. As part of this plan, God will reestablish a system of righteous, just, and fair governance. So what does the world look like when God is actually in charge? So let's turn over to what God revealed to Jeremiah again in Jeremiah 31, and starting in verse 13, reading verses 13 and 14. So Jeremiah 31, and reading verses 13 and 14. Then shall the virgin rejoice in the dance, and the young men and the old together. For I will turn their mourning to joy, will comfort them, and make them rejoice rather than sorrow. I will satiate the soul of the priest with abundance, and my people shall be satisfied with my goodness, says the Lord. The unfairness, the perceived hopelessness and demoralizing experiences that we may experience in this world will be alleviated when Satan is no longer exerting his power over mankind. In short, we know that God has a much greater future planned for us that will be just and fair. So this current age that we live in is unpleasant in many ways. As a collective group, as mankind together, or as a nation, we want to look around and marvel at what we've accomplished. And we really would like to say, oh, look at all these great things, and look at all these great things that we've all accomplished together. But it's all too easy to look around and see how things are actually run behind the scenes. Under the heavy sway of Satan, we can see how deeply ungodly the world has become around us. And to play off of Mr. Sachs's famous quote, it's hard to see how this life is fair once we know how the sausages are made. But we have God's truth, and we know why this world is unfair, and that God's plan involves fixing the world order to establish truth, justice, and righteousness. And I believe Paul summarizes the mindset we need to keep well in Romans 8 and verse 18. And I'll just read that for you. Romans 8 and verse 18 simply states, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us." We should take great comfort in the fact that what we face now is not only temporary, but minuscule in comparison with the glorious future that we will have with God. Christ is coming, and with him he brings the solutions to all the corruption and evil that we face in this life, and he will remove them forevermore. I will now conclude by reading a passage from Psalms 111, verses 49 through 52, which I think touches upon the comfort that God gives us through the knowledge of his truth in the current age. So Psalm 119, starting in verse 49. "Remember the word to your servant, upon which you have caused me to hope. This is my comfort in my affliction. For your word has given me life. The proud have me in great derision, yet I do not turn aside from your law. I remembered your judgments of old, O Lord, and have comforted myself." A good Sabbath to you all.